Good morning. I am Poe Leggett, head of the energy team. Welcome to our webinar on the Russian petroleum ban. Our panelists today are Melissa Menino and Jessica Leonard. Melissa is a Chambers ranked partner who advises U.S. and foreign companies on all aspects of U.S. export controls and, significantly for this program, economic sanctions laws. Melissa's years in government, coupled with her experience in private practice, have given her an in-depth working knowledge of jurisdictional, licensing, and enforcement matters. Jessica Leonard is a highly respected energy and environmental policy expert with over 20 years of experience in Congress, in government, and with private sector clients. Before joining Baker Hostetler as a senior advisor, Jessica was a legislative aide to Representative Pallone and Senator Durbin, both holding leadership positions. Let's start with some context. In its March 8 press briefing, the administration explained that Russian oil was 10% of our total imports of oil and petroleum liquids. We imported about 700,000 barrels a day. This slide from the Energy Information Administration shows the full picture of Russian exports of all fossil fuels last year. Russia exports the vast majority of its production. China, the Netherlands, Germany, Poland, and South Korea have been the major importers of Russian crude and petroleum products. Now, 6 points about the petroleum trade between the US and Russia. We have shipped liquefied natural gas, LNG, once to Russia in October 2007. We have not imported Russian LNG directly, at least since 2014. We did import a Russian LNG shipment indirectly in 2018 into Everett, Massachusetts, and that caused a stir. Even the Boston Globe criticized the state government for blocking pipelines that could have brought gas up from Pennsylvania and instead bringing gas in from foreign sources. The Russian supplier, Novatek, was also on a Crimea sanctions list, but the LNG had been stored and commingled in the United Kingdom before coming to Everett. Point 3, has Russia imported US oil? Apparently not. Russia produces 3 times what it consumes, and we only started allowing crude oil exports in December 2016. Point 4, we, on the other hand, have imported Russian petroleum since at least 1995. On screen is a bar chart showing US imports of Russian petroleum between 2015 and 2021. Our average annual imports have increased. 370,000 barrels a day in 2015, 440 in 2016, 389 in 2017, 375 in 2018, but 520 in 2019, 540 in 2020, and 672,000 last year, which the White House rounded up to 700,000 barrels a day. 6, finally, 2 perspectives on the near-term effect of these sanctions. First, since 2015, we have imported the most Russian oil during the months of May through August, the summer driving season. Those 4 months last year averaged 811,000 barrels a day, totaling 100 million barrels. If we would have imported the same this year, and if the Russians would have received a net price of $100 a barrel, that would have been $10 billion for those 4 months. Now, 10 billion US dollars are not going to Russia. Second, 2 days ago, the International Energy Agency's monthly oil market report estimated that shutdowns of Russian production could begin as soon as April 3rd and eventually aggregate to 3 million barrels per day. The basis for this estimate was not readily available. I turn now to our first panelist, Melissa Menino.
Thanks, Poe. My part of the webinar is going to focus on the economic sanctions and the export controls that have been imposed because of the Russian Federation's invasion of Ukraine. And hopefully we're going to focus on the ones that are most pertinent to the energy sector. Give the caveat that what I say now is I believe still currently the law, but it could change by the end of the day or by Monday. So this is a very fluid situation. And so it needs to be closely monitored. So when we talk about economic sanctions, let me just give you a little background for people that may be new to this area. The economic sanctions are administered and enforced by the U.S. Department of the Treasury Office of Foreign Assets Control, known as OFAC. And they apply to U.S. citizens wherever located, so the U.S. or abroad, U.S. permanent residents or green card holders. They apply to any individual located in the United States. They can apply to employees of foreign branches of U.S. companies, and in some cases, employees of foreign subsidiaries of U.S. businesses. So very broad reach. And there's been multiple ways that OFAC has imposed sanctions because of the invasion. One of the ways is designating individuals or entities, especially designated nationals or SDNs. This is the most restrictive designation that the U.S. can do, and it prohibits U.S. persons from doing business with an SDN in really any way, shape, or form. It also requires that property or interest in property of SDNs that are either in the United States or in the possession of U.S. persons need to be frozen. And so as part of these designations, and we're going to walk through the sanction sort of chronological order, on February 23rd, the U.S. government designated Nord Stream 2 AG, the company behind the Nord Stream 2 pipeline between Russia and Germany, and its chief executive officer, especially designated nationals. OFAC did issue a general license, which authorizes certain activities that would otherwise be prohibited. And that general license allowed U.S. persons to wind down business with Nord Stream 2 and Mr. Warnig. However, that expired on March 1st. So if there's any business that needs to be wound down, you now need to go to the Department of Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control and get a license. In addition to designating Nord Stream 2, a number of significant Russian financial institutions, as well as other Russians and Belarusians, have been designated, especially designated nationals. But OFAC did issue a general license authorizing certain transactions related to energy if certain of the financial institutions that have been designated are involved. And those designated financial institutions include Central Bank of Russia, and several others. That general license is available through June 23rd. And again, the authorizations are very specific and can be very narrow. So it's important to make sure you understand the terms and conditions fully before you decide to proceed under that authority. Great. Next slide, please. And I will say, I think I forgot to mention the first slide. So the Russian energy sector, it's not under a comprehensive sanction. There's not a total ban on doing business with it. There are certain prohibitions that are in place, but in certain cases you can do business, and sometimes you will have to go into the government and get a license. But as we'll discuss, it's not a total ban. So as Poe mentioned, one of the other significant sanctions that has been imposed is the import ban into the United States of Russian Federation origin crude oil, petroleum fuels, oils, and products of their distillation, liquefied natural gas, coal, and coal products. There is a general license that authorizes through April 21 transactions that are ordinarily incident and necessary to the importation of what I'll call the banned products, the ones listed in the prohibition, so long as that importation is pursuant to written contracts or written agreements that were entered into prior to March 8th. A couple things that are important about this import ban is you'll notice the ban is on Russian Federation origin items. And Russian Federation origin includes goods produced, manufactured, extracted, or processed in the Russian Federation. Now, they do carve out from the ban Russian Federation origin products that have been incorporated or substantially transformed into a foreign-made product. So guessing you probably have a couple questions related to this ban, and I think Poe alluded to one earlier, which is about the commingling and the substantial transformation. So if you have a company in Canada that says, yes, we have some crude oil that we want to send to the US, you're going to need to do the diligence to figure out, is there any Russian Federation origin crude oil in there? And if so, is it going to fall within the exclusion? And I think in this carve out, and it's going to be, I think, a very fact specific analysis, one that OFAC has not issued guidance on. So that one, I think, just because it may have been quote unquote commingled, I would not automatically assume it's covered by the carve out. Also, because the focus is on Russian Federation origin, you can't do indirectly what you can't do directly. So if said a Canadian has the Russian Federation origin liquefied natural gas, you cannot acquire that from the Canadian because you couldn't do it directly. So it is the origin, not necessarily that it's coming directly from Russia. Also on March 8th, the US imposed an investment ban on the energy sector in the Russian Federation. And again, this is broad, and OFAC has a lot of discretion on how it wants to interpret it. But the prohibition includes any commitment or contribution of funds or other assets for, or a loan or other extension of credit to energy sector activities located or incurring in the Russian Federation. And again, we're looking at March 8th. So again, here we have two important factors. One is occurring in the Russian Federation. So if you needed to make an extension, you want to extend credit to a company, say in China, that was doing business in Russia in the energy sector, that's going to be prohibited because of their activities in Russia. So you need to just make sure that if you're doing anything that could potentially be caught under this ban, you look to see where it's happening, even if the company's not in Russia. And again, the definition of energy is very broad. It covers the companies that you would traditionally think, the ones involved in the extraction, production, refinement, liquefaction of products capable of producing energy. And again, this includes, crude oil, natural gas, but also coal, wood, or other agricultural products that are used to manufacture biofuels. And it also covers companies involved in the development, production, generation, or transmission of power through any means. So again, very important to look at the terms. OFAC has issued some guidance, but not a lot on these. So it is important to verify that your specific facts, because one fact can make a difference as to whether you're going to be caught under the ban or a general license may apply. Great. Again, next slide. So next we'll focus on the export controls I think are most relevant to the Russian energy sector. And again, so the export controls, they're administered by the US Department of Commerce's Bureau of Industry and Security. And their jurisdiction, unlike the OFAC sanctions, focuses on the products, technology, or software involved. So they apply to US and foreign persons the same. It's what is the good commodity that's at issue. And when we talk about exports, that's a shipment from the US to foreign country, in this case, Russia. Re-exports can be shipment from one foreign country to another. So US origin items that may be in Canada that are going to go to Russia will be subject to the same restrictions as if they were shipped from the US or if they're transferred within country. And for those also new to this area, there are key terms called what is the export control classification number, or ECCN, of your item, or is it EAR 99, which is a catch-all for all things subject to the export administration regulations, but not listed on the Commerce Control List. And these terms are important because you need to know the ECCN or classification of what you may be exporting to know whether certain license requirements are going to apply. So one of the new license requirements that's particularly relevant for the energy sector is a license for the export, re-export, or transfer to or within Russia or Belarus all designated oil refinery sector equipment. This is equipment that traditionally would not have required a license to go to Russia, but now will. The items that are covered are listed by their harmonized tariff schedule code or their Schedule B number, and they are in Supplement 4 to Part 746 of the Export Administration Regulations. One of the key codes that is covered are those for oil and gas wire, field wire line and downhole equipment. So important to check that if you're exporting any type of oil field refinery equipment to Russia or Belarus. And again, that applies irrespective of end use or end user. The second set of license requirements, which also applies irrespective of what the end user is in Russia, is if you have items subject to the Export Administration Regulations that are in categories 3 through 9 of the EAR. And for those of you familiar with the EAR, there's 10 categories, 0 through 9. So this captures almost all items on the Commerce Control List. And this is very broad, and it includes everything from microelectronics to aircraft, information technology, information security, sensors. So if you are doing any business with Russia or Belarus, need to make sure you know what your classification is, and because the licenses now may be required, and violations of the law are strict liability. One of the other controls that's been implemented is what we call the foreign direct product rule. And this really applies to foreign companies that may be incorporating US origin parts, components, or materials, or developing products from US origin technology or software that are going to Russia. And foreign companies would need to come in and get a license just like US companies would. And so a product that is produced abroad, that is the direct product of US technology or software that's covered in one of those categories, 3 through 9, or based out of a plant or a major component of a plant, such as like a CNC machine tool equipment. If those are US origin, the product that's produced for them may be captured under the regulations. And then there has to be knowledge that the foreign produced item is going to Russia or Belarus, or will be incorporated into the production development of any part, component, or equipment that will go to Russia or Belarus. If the foreign produced part is designated as year 99, so not listed on the Commerce Control List subject, then it would fall out of this license requirement. But again, because of the enhanced license requirements, it's very important to understand all the parts, materials, and components that are going into those. Great. Next slide. And just a few practical tips for if you're doing business, particularly in Russia or Belarus at this point. Screen each party to a transaction. As mentioned, the designations as specially designated nationals, as well as other U.S. export and sanctions lists of denied persons are important, and you want to make sure that no sanctioned person is involved in your transaction anywhere in the transaction. And there's a free online government screening tool that you can use if you're new to this and only have a few parties to screen, which is very helpful. As I mentioned, the prohibitions for SDNs also apply to any entity that is owned 50% or more individually or in the aggregate by an SDN. You also said need to verify what your export control classification numbers are, what your HTS codes or Schedule B numbers are, to make sure you're not subject to the new license requirements. And recommend obtaining completed and updated end user statements, either from your customers, whether they be directly in Russia or intermediaries or parties that you believe may sell into Russia, because they said are subject to those obligations as well. And because a lot of these violations are strict liability, it's important to, if the government ever comes knocking at your door, you can have this paperwork to show that you did your diligence and you believed your transaction was authorized under the applicable laws. And with that, I will turn it over to Jessica.
Thank you so much, Melissa. That was a lot to digest. I am going to provide a brief recap of what we've seen in the past 3 weeks in DC, and then provide some more thoughts on what we might see in the coming months or so. 2 weeks ago, President Biden signed Executive Order 14066, the ban that Melissa spoke to the impacts of. And this was a change from what the administration had been saying, that there'd be no sanctions on energy, partly given concern about inflation, as well as any impact it would have in further increasing gas prices. However, pressure was growing from Congress, first with introduction of a bipartisan bill by Chair of the Senate Energy Committee, Joe Manchin, that proposed a straight out Russian oil import ban, and then with a flurry of other bills proposed similarly in both the House and the Senate. So we saw the president act before Congress did. However, the House proceeded, and Democrats and Republicans in the House cast aside their partisanship, and with a vote of 414 to 17, passed H.R. 6968, which was a ban on Russian oil imports. The bill was partly moot given that the executive order had just been signed, but this vote was a sign of strong congressional support, and it further included provisions beyond the EO regarding Russia's World Trade Organization status and human rights violations. The bill stopped in the House right now because the Senate has not considered that bill or the bill introduced by Senator Manchin, and at this point, it's unlikely to do so. There have been a plethora of bills introduced in both chambers related to Russia, energy, sanctions, ally assistance, production, and I know only one here from Chair of the Senate Finance Committee, Senator Wyden, as an example, but there are 100 or more. However, unity in Congress on energy issues has seemed to stop at the House vote last week. Since then, we've seen vastly disparate views develop on how the US should proceed on energy policy. Earlier this week, a group of 89 progressive Democrats called for climate change to be declared a national emergency, a restart of discussions on climate policy, a ban on drilling on federal lands, and acceleration of investments in renewable and alternative energy. This message was received as partly tone deaf by more pragmatic Democrats and Republicans, given the challenge is not only to reach consensus on these issues, but also the inability of any of those longer term proposals to address current conditions, which we all see as high gas prices. During a recent discussion I had, it was shared that reasonable proposals that actually impact and address the current situation will be seriously considered, but with an understanding there is little authority or capability of Congress to directly impact current prices at the pump. In fact, I just saw a headline pop up in one of today's political papers that reads, quote, "Democrats are floating a whole smorgasbord of options to tackle high gasoline costs, but acknowledge many of them won't work," end of quote. Spot on. Many of them will not work. And furthermore, the large hurdle or even the barrier for the progressive policies lies in the Senate with Senator Manchin, who favors an all of the above energy approach. He's noted interest in finding agreement on climate, but seeks to maximize US energy resources, such as increasing traditional and available energy production, as well as increasing LNG exports, simultaneous to advancing renewable and alternative energy resources. While discussions between Manchin and the White House, as well as the chair of the Senate Environment Committee, Senator Carper, are ongoing, Chairman Manchin has minimized the likelihood of something large related to climate passing the Senate. So what can we expect in the coming months or so in DC? Well, political messaging has clearly linked gas prices and the Russia oil ban with climate policy, renewables, and alternative energy spending on one side, while the other prioritizes increasing production of traditional energy sources and notes the long time frame needed for any kind of energy transition discussed by many Democrats. However, neither of these singular positions will advance given the vote margins in both the House and the Senate, and specifically the one needed with Senator Manchin's desire to find agreement that will appropriately maximize all of the resources. This discussion is now being had in light of the significant needs created by today's political and international conditions. So it's changed the overarching nature of the debate a bit. There is far more at stake, or at least it's become clearer and more obvious as to what is at stake. As we witnessed post 9/11, the geopolitical and national security concerns that again unified Congress, at least in one instance last week, have actually reignited debate about energy independence and energy security. Over the course of the next month, the Senate has a very busy schedule focused primarily on confirming the Supreme Court nominee, bringing the Competes Act to conference, and possibly taking up reconciliation. Some see reconciliation as an opportunity for Democrats to take even the slightest win on energy and climate policy, and one that many feel they need heading into a midterm election season. So we'll see. Right now, the opportunity is in raising the issues of importance in the energy policy space to members of Congress as they deliberate on the issues and on what's next. I, along with the rest of the Baker Hostetler federal policy team, will sit riveted in our seat and will continue to monitor the discussions as they develop. I will leave you with an invitation to contact me anytime, as we are always open to provide guidance, assistance, and information. These issues are, as all are in Washington, dynamic, so please do not hesitate to reach out to me, as there is one thing I can guarantee, that things are always changing here. Thank you. Poe, you want to close out the discussion?
Jessica, thank you very much. For those of you attending, the takeaways are clear, as Melissa explained. These are complex requirements, but there are opportunities, both even with regard to the sanctions program and more particularly with America's response to elimination of imports of Russian petroleum for, well, centrist, reasonable, moderate fixes that might seem small in the national policy picture, but which might be very significant to your companies. I invite you to think about those and to let us know if Melissa and Jessica can help. If you have questions, we invite you to send them to us. We thank you so much for your participation today and hope you have a great Friday.
Thank you.